My name is Rachel Schlueter, and I'm studying International Relations and Public Health, and today I'm here to share with you what trash taught me about the development of East African cities. But first, let's become familiar with this historical context of Kenya's government structure. So contemporary borders in Africa are defined by previous colonial divisions, and in many ways mirror natural resources rather than the existing linguistic, ethnic, and religious groups. Kenya in particular received its independence in 1963 and inherited this former British imperial institutional structure and policies. Even after independence, this structure remained problematic because power was centralized at the center without any consideration of variances within the regions. So in 2010, in an attempt to address these political issues as well as others, the government of Kenya adopted a new constitution and instituted a policy of devolution. Now, devolution does two things. First, it replaced 8 provinces with 47 counties. And then second, decentralized the national authority to this county administration. This added tier of governance is intended to improve both upstream policymaking as well as bring downstream resource allocation closer to the people themselves. So what does this have to do with trash? So the United Nations Environment Program considers solid waste management a metric of good governance. What they're claiming is that the government's ability to manage solid waste management indicates in many ways the efficiency and responsiveness of that government due to the sheer amount of coordination and capital that's required to service all citizens. In Kenya's case, the 2010 Constitution specifically calls for the coordination of government at all levels through the integration of existing stakeholders, rather than creating an entirely new framework. Integration is also being used to guide the development of efficient urban services. So in order to appropriately understand the institutional and individual experiences under this new period of Kenya's devolved constitution, I decided to look at waste in Kisumu. As the third largest city in Kenya with a population over 500,000, Kisumu is strategic geographically, politically, and economically as a hub for the Lake Victoria Basin, which supports over 3 million people in its watershed. Kisumu is well situated to be a model of how devolution is impacting other rural to urban transitions in Kenya. And due to a variety of factors, there's already a large international presence in Kisumu to address the uniquely endemic issues of the region, and many are tuned into this national attention on waste. So despite this additional attention, there's still a gap of services and policies. The current services only account for 20% of all waste that is being produced in the city. This remains 80% of waste to be handled individually by households, which has significant ramifications not only for public health but for the environment. And this most immediately will affect the households and compound onto the city level. So for these reasons, it's essential to have a representative understanding of the history and changes of solid waste management since 2010. Informing my methodology were 2 questions. First, what role does local government at both the county and city level play in managing Kisumu's waste? Then, how does this inform our understanding of the efficacy of devolution in Kenya? To establish the institutional context, I conducted over 15 hours of interviews with key informant stakeholders last April. My interviewees represented the county and city government in both the Departments of Environment and Public Health, as well as private collectors of waste. My questions mostly circled around the historical basis of waste in Kisumu, as well as metrics of integrated solid waste management. And I sought to really describe Kisumu's current waste system and discover how this devolved government is responding. To capture the individual perspectives, I then captured 25 conversational surveys with residents. And I did this to expand on the individual disposal methods that people face when it comes to waste, as well as gauging environmental health impacts and discuss local actions taking place. Most of my research was conducted in English, Swahili, and Luo, but since I'm not fluent in Luo, I received a translator to conduct the interviews, and I received informed consent from all participants. To complement my ethnographic research, I then contextualized my findings into the literature, mostly circling around devolution, urban governance, and environmental health. So, let's look at the role of local government. It became clear that the government operates complementary to the private sector as well as the informal sector. And this isn't a result of an integration effort from the government, but rather a historical basis of public-private partnerships and informal groups capitalizing on this gap in service management. So since devolution, their contributions, have been almost rebranded as integration. And so building on top of this, I teased out 3 central themes that can be examined through both the lens of an institutional and individual role. First, to describe the limitations of the system, I identified points of tension. Moving from left to right, the 2010 Constitution states that counties are solely responsible for the provision of solid waste management in Kisumu. However, the current complementary system contradicts this entirely. And then within government institutions, there's 2 clear barriers. First, governments have fundamentally different approaches to how waste is managed. A public health official may advocate for prevention, whereas an official in the Department of Environment focuses solely on service provision. This would appear to be an integrated approach, but it's worsened through a barrier of administrative silos, which creates a condition of miscommunication rather than collaboration. This disconnect not only harms government functioning, but also harms the private sector, particularly in their lack of licensing. In Devolution, they were promised that they could be licensed and strengthen this public-private partnership, but they've only received permits, which does not allow them to obtain loans and expand their services. And finally, we have the informal sector, which consists of waste pickers separating recyclables for resale. But under this integrated approach, they've been encouraged to continue the work alongside the county government. But they aren't provided with any labor or safety protections since they're not county employees. So rather, it puts them at risk and is a near exploitation of the informal sector as a whole. But that's ironic because the informal sector only exists because of mismanagement from the government in the first place. So second, these conditions reveal individual burdens, but also opens a political opportunity for improvements. So in my survey, I asked respondents, how do you dispose of your waste? And more than half of my sample replied that they individually deal with their waste with limited safe options. I also observed that very few people actually used private services, and this speaks to the fact that accessibility is often related to income, with over half of Kisumu's residents living in poverty. Second, I asked who's responsible or should be responsible for managing waste, and the majority of responses actually called on the government, and an interesting fact is that most of them saw it as a collective responsibility. So they're identifying themselves as having an active role in the conservation of their environment. However, this isn't necessarily reflected in the politicians' point of view. They don't see this as a collective effort, they see it as if they improve the system, it's going to create a dependence on the government. And so this negative association was consistent throughout all of the government representatives. So fringes of this waste system also provide insights into the representative constituent communication under this new system of devolution, and we can use this to forecast development. So in my interviews, one public health official stated, how can you develop a town when you don't have the management? This is speaking to the friction that often exists between visions and actual implementations of plans. And it also challenges to expand our understanding of the government's role when it comes to managing waste. Is it simply for the sake of service, or is it rather creating this indicator of capacity to possible investors? And since devolution in 2010, there's also been targeted attempts to develop Kisumu. And so now we know that each set of funds might not necessarily be targeting this whole complex system, but instead may be exacerbating mismanagement. So this now informs our understanding of devolution as a whole. With this ongoing mismanagement, lack of accountable coordination, and we may also want to question the devolved structure itself. So a view that arose frequently within my study was that devolution maybe just devolved a political climate of corruption. So this would undercut accountability entirely, and it's a compelling argument given the fact that there's been contention over recent elections in Kenya. But our conversation isn't just limited to these limitations, but there's approaches being taken on the ground that capture the spirit of community-controlled resources. So leveraging existing community outreach centers, private individuals and organizations have organized cleanups. And in fact, there was a model under the National Youth Service which provided wages to residents to create a grassroots collection service. However, that was discontinued due to reported financial limitations, but it did prove its efficacy to residents and that it is something that could work. And so this possibly might be the most fruitful path forward. And the only way to do this is to recognize local actions first, seek community perspectives, and then ask them what the best form of support would be. So throughout all of this, it became clear that devolution has created a necessary apparatus for accountability, but as of right now, it's being misused due to the government's systemic tensions, negative constituent relations, and a misalignment of visions and actions. And we're still waiting to see if devolution will actually address these issues, as it's only been implemented in 2010. However, these recent electoral contentions and some other issues are cause for alarm. So taking what we have learned about government's role in managing waste and recentering the community-based visualization of devolution, we should also focus on this demonstration of power at the local level. And in thinking of this, we also need to critique our own conception of neoliberal metrics of integration that are used by the government but also used in my own research instruments. Does integration even count as development? And are the current approaches actually representative of reality? Finally, all of this is even more pressing with the impacts of climate change already altering Kenya's landscape, which is only adding pressure to these institutions, which must break administrative silos and recenter constituent voices in order to address the limitations of devolution to protect the welfare of the people of Kisumu and Kenya more generally. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Could you talk more about the conflict between city and county in the devolution policy, if that is as significant as the sort of federal versus county tensions?
Yeah, the city and the county tensions are particularly interesting because the city, especially in Kisumu, City Hall has been established since the colonial era. So they've had an administrative existence, but then you enter in this county structure, and so suddenly you have two people looking at the same city, and there isn't necessarily communication happening as to how they can integrate urban services, and crucial urban services, including sanitation, sewerage, and waste is just one example. So it's an issue that a lot of Kenyans have to deal with, but since there's only really 3 major cities at the moment, this is more so a forecast for what may come as urbanization increases in Kenya. Any other questions? All right, thank you so much.